A disgraced woman, a broken rancher, a town that buries the truth. Ruth Calloway arrived in Black Hollow with nothing but a lie and a trunk full of shame. The man who promised her work had vanished. The town wanted her gone. And the one man who could save her, Wade Mercer, hadn't spoken a full sentence in 3 years. But when a child stopped breathing in her arms and the whole town froze in fear, Ruth had one chance to prove she wasn't the failure everyone believed her to be. Stay until the end. Hit that like button. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach hit another rut, and Ruth Calloway's head cracked against the wooden frame hard enough to make her teeth click together. She didn't complain. The two other passengers, a whiskey drummer with yellow teeth and a ranch hand who smelled like tobacco and sweat, had stopped trying to make conversation with her 50 miles back. That suited her fine. The less they knew about why a woman like her was traveling alone into the frontier, the better. Through the dust-caked window, she watched the landscape turn hostile. The green hills of Missouri had given way to endless brown grassland that rolled toward mountains she couldn't name. The trees were twisted and sparse. The sky was too big. Everything about this place felt like it wanted to swallow her whole. Good, she thought. Let it. The trunk at her feet held everything she owned. 3 dresses, her mother's medicine journal, a single photograph she should have burned, and the letter that had brought her here. She'd read that letter so many times the paper was soft as cloth at the creases. Dear Miss Calloway, I am in need of a governess for my 2 daughters, ages 7 and 9, room and board provided, salary of $40 per month. References required. Please arrive by the first week of September. Ask for Mr. Joshua Farrell at the Black Hollow Post Office. Respectfully, Joshua Farrell. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had back in Philadelphia, where her name had become poison and her father's crimes had stained her so thoroughly that even former friends crossed the street to avoid her. She'd been desperate enough to lie on the reference letter, desperate enough to spend her last $17 on a ticket west, desperate enough to believe that a man she'd never met might actually keep his word. The stagecoach lurched to a stop. "Black Hollow!" the driver shouted from above. "End of the line!" Ruth stepped down into ankle-deep dust and immediately regretted every decision that had brought her to this moment. The town wasn't a town. It was a collection of sun-baked buildings squatting in the dirt like they'd given up trying to be anything else. A crooked sign above the general store, a saloon with busted shutters, a church that looked abandoned, maybe 30 structures total, and half of them leaning. The ranch hand grabbed his bedroll and disappeared without a word. The drummer spat tobacco juice into the street and followed. Ruth stood alone beside her trunk, squinting against the September sun, while the stage driver tossed down mailbags and didn't look at her twice. "Excuse me," she called up to him. "Where's the post office?" He pointed at a narrow building with peeling paint. "Right there, but Thornton don't open till after lunch." "Mr. Farrell was supposed to meet me." The driver paused, one boot on the wheel hub. He looked at her now, really looked, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite pity, more like the look you'd give a horse with a broken leg. "Joshua Farrell?" "Yes, I'm the governess he hired." The man climbed down slow, dusting off his vest. He was older than she'd thought, with deep lines around his mouth and eyes that had seen too much. "Ma'am, I don't know what correspondence you had with Josh Farrell, but he ain't been seen in Black Hollow for near about 6 weeks. The words hit her like cold water. "What?" "Left town middle of August. Didn't tell nobody where he was going or when he'd be back. His ranch has been sitting empty ever since." Ruth's hands went numb. "That's not possible. He sent me a letter. He told me to come in September. I'm just telling you what I know." The driver's voice wasn't unkind, but it was final. "You might try talking to Sheriff Hobson. He's the one who's been watching Farrell's place." He climbed back onto the stage without another word. The horses jerked forward, wheels churning dust, and Ruth was left standing in the middle of an empty street with her entire life in a trunk and nowhere to go. She didn't cry. She'd used up all her tears back east. Instead, she picked up her skirts, gripped the handle of her trunk, and dragged it toward the post office. Her arms burned. Her dress stuck to her back with sweat. People watched from doorways and windows. She could feel their eyes like weight, but nobody came to help. The post office was locked. She tried the general store next. A man with a stained apron looked up from behind the counter, his expression already closing off before she even spoke. "Help you?" "I'm looking for Mr. Joshua Farrell. I was hired to work for him." "Farrell's gone." "So I've been told, but I need to find him, or at least find out where he went." The shopkeeper shook his head, turning back to his ledger. "Can't help you. Try the sheriff." She found the sheriff's office 2 buildings down, a squat structure with bars on the windows, and a man asleep in a chair outside, hat tipped over his face. Ruth cleared her throat. "Excuse me, are you Sheriff Hobson?" The man tilted his hat back with one finger. He was younger than she expected, maybe 35, with a lean face and eyes that cataloged her in about 3 seconds. Eastern clothes, battered trunk, no husband, no prospects. "That's me. I'm Ruth Calloway. I was hired by Joshua Farrell to be a governess for his daughters, but I've just been told he's disappeared." Hobson stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "That's about the size of it. Farrell rode out 6 weeks ago saying he had business in Denver. Never came back. We sent a wire to the marshal up there, but haven't heard nothing yet." "And his daughters?" "He don't have daughters, ma'am." The ground seemed to tilt. "I'm sorry?" "Josh Farrell's a bachelor. Always has been. Runs cattle on a patch of scrubland north of here. Drinks too much. Gambles worse. He sure as hell don't have children." Ruth's throat closed. She opened her handbag with shaking hands and pulled out the letter, thrusting it toward the sheriff. "He sent me this. He offered me a position. I have a reference letter. Hobson read it, his jaw tightening. When he handed it back, his voice was gentler. "Miss Calloway, I don't know who wrote this letter, but it wasn't Josh Farrell. That's not his handwriting. And even if it was, the man don't have 2 nickels to rub together, let alone $40 a month to pay a governess." The world went very still. "So I've been deceived." "Looks that way." She folded the letter carefully, pressed it back into her handbag, and forced herself to breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her mother taught her when the panic came. "Is there a boarding house in town?" "Mrs. McKenna runs one behind the saloon, but I'll be straight with you. It ain't cheap, and it ain't clean." "How much?" $2 a week, meals included." Ruth had exactly $4.30 left, enough for 2 weeks if she didn't eat much. After that, she didn't let herself finish the thought. "Thank you, Sheriff." She turned before he could offer sympathy she didn't want. The boarding house was worse than she'd imagined. It squatted behind the saloon like something that had crawled there to die. A 2-story structure with a sagging porch and windows so dirty she couldn't see through them. The sign above the door said, "McKenna's Rooms in faded paint." Ruth knocked. The woman who answered was built like a barrel, with iron gray hair scraped into a bun and a face that had forgotten how to smile. She looked Ruth up and down with the cold assessment of someone who'd seen 1,000 desperate women and didn't have patience for 1,001. "Mrs. McKenna? That's right. I need a room. $2 a week, in advance. You get supper at 6 and breakfast at dawn. You miss it, you don't eat. No men in the rooms, no noise after 10. You cause trouble, you're out." Ruth counted out $2 from her purse and handed them over. The bills were damp with sweat. Mrs. McKenna pocketed the money and jerked her head toward the stairs. "Third door on the left, linens are in the cupboard, privy's out back." The room was 8 feet by 10 with a narrow bed, a cracked wash basin, and a window that looked out onto an alley full of trash. Ruth set her trunk down, sat on the edge of the mattress, and stared at the wall. She'd crossed half the country for a job that didn't exist. She had 2 weeks before her money ran out, and nobody in this town knew her name or cared whether she lived or died. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, Ruth Calloway let herself consider the possibility that she'd made a terrible mistake. Yes, supper was salt pork, boiled potatoes, and bread so hard it could break teeth. Ruth sat at the long table in the boarding house dining room, surrounded by men who smelled like horses and didn't bother with conversation. Mrs. McKenna dumped food onto plates without ceremony, collected the empty dishes, and disappeared into the kitchen. Ruth forced herself to eat. The pork was nearly inedible, but she was hungry enough not to care. Across the table, a man with a scarred face and graying beard watched her with the kind of attention that made her skin crawl. When she stood to leave, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You're new." "Yes." Stay in long? I haven't decided. A woman alone. He said it like a diagnosis. That's dangerous country for someone like you. Ruth met his eyes without flinching. I'll manage. She walked out before he could say anything else. That night, she lay awake listening to the sounds of Black Hollow. Drunken shouting from the saloon, dogs barking in the alleys, the wind rattling the loose boards of the boarding house. Through the thin walls, she could hear a man coughing in the next room, deep, wet coughs that went on and on. She thought about her father, about the trial, about the way the judge had looked at her when he'd asked if she'd known what her father was doing. No, she'd said. I didn't know. It was the truth. But nobody believed her. Her father had been a banker, respected and trusted, until the day federal marshals dragged him out of their home in front of half of Philadelphia. Embezzlement, fraud, forgery. The list went on. He'd stolen from clients, from friends, from the church fund. And when it all came crashing down, he'd hanged himself in his cell before the trial even finished. Ruth and her mother had been left with nothing, not even their name. Her mother died 6 months later. The doctor said it was pneumonia, but Ruth knew better. It was shame. It was exhaustion. It was the weight of being looked at like a criminal every time she left the house. Ruth had tried to find work, but every door closed the moment they learned who her father was. So she'd answered a letter from a stranger promising her a new life in a place where nobody knew her name. And now here she was, alone. Again. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. Mats. The scream woke her just before midnight. Ruth bolted upright, heart hammering, as the sound echoed through the boarding house, high and terrified and wrong. She grabbed her shawl and ran into the hallway. Other doors were opening, men in undershirts, women with loose hair, everyone stumbling into the narrow corridor lit by a single kerosene lamp. Mrs. McKenna was already at the far end, standing outside a room with the door flung wide. "What happened?" someone shouted. "It's the Callahan boy," Mrs. McKenna said, her voice tight. "He can't breathe." Ruth pushed through the crowd. Inside the room, a woman knelt on the floor cradling a child. A boy maybe 7 years old, his face dark red and his mouth open in a soundless gasp. His eyes were wide with terror, his small hands clawed at his throat. "He just started choking," the woman sobbed. "I don't know what happened. He just—" The boy's lips were turning blue. Ruth dropped to her knees beside them. "Let me see him." "Who the hell are you?" the woman snapped. "Someone who can help." "Let me see him." The woman hesitated, then shifted the boy toward Ruth. Ruth pressed her ear to his chest. She could hear the wheeze, tight and strangled, air trying to move through a passage that was swelling shut. Not choking, not something stuck in his throat. An attack. The kind her mother had taught her to recognize. "Get me hot water," Ruth said, "and a towel. Now." Mrs. McKenna didn't move. "What are you going to do?" "Save him if you let me. The water. Now." Something in Ruth's voice cut through the panic. Mrs. McKenna turned and shoved her way toward the kitchen. Ruth looked at the boy's mother. "Has this happened before?" "Once. Last winter. The doctor said it was his lungs." "It's not his lungs. It's his airways. They're closing." Ruth tilted the boy's head back, opening his throat as much as possible. His whole body was rigid with the effort of trying to pull in air. She could see the pulse hammering in his neck. "Listen to me," she said quietly, leaning close to his ear. "You're going to be all right, but I need you to stay calm. Can you do that?" The boy's eyes found hers. He nodded, just barely. Mrs. McKenna returned with a basin of steaming water and a rag. Ruth soaked the towel, wrung it out, and draped it over the boy's face, creating a tent of hot vapor around his nose and mouth. "Breathe slow," she murmured. "Let the steam open you up." For 10 seconds, nothing changed. Then the boy gasped, a real gasp, pulling air, and his chest expanded. Another breath, ragged and wet, but real. His color started to return. The blue faded from his lips. Ruth kept the towel in place, reheating it every few minutes, while the boy's breathing slowly steadied. The crowd in the doorway watched in silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. After 20 minutes, the boy was breathing almost normally. His mother was crying into her hands. Ruth sat back on her heels, suddenly aware that her own hands were shaking. He'll need to stay warm tonight, she said quietly. And if it happens again, do exactly what I just did. Hot steam. It opens the airways. The boy's mother grabbed Ruth's hand. Thank you. Oh, God, thank you. Ruth pulled away gently. He's all right. That's what matters. She stood, every eye in the hallway following her as she walked back to her room. She closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and pressed her palms against her face. Her heart was still racing. She hadn't saved anyone in a long time. Book. The next morning, Ruth woke to the sound of voices outside her door. She dressed quickly and stepped into the hallway. Mrs. McKenna was standing at the top of the stairs with her arms crossed, blocking the way down. She's staying, Mrs. McKenna said flatly. I'm just asking to meet her, a man's voice replied from below. And I'm telling you, she don't owe you a conversation. Margaret, I ain't here to cause trouble. Ruth appeared at the top of the stairs. It's all right, Mrs. McKenna. The older woman glanced back, her expression unreadable. Then she stepped aside. The man at the bottom of the stairs was maybe 50, with a drooping mustache and a shirt that had seen better days. He twisted his hat in his hands. Miss Calloway? I'm Tom Callahan. That was my boy you helped last night. Is he all right? He's breathing easy. Slept through the night for the first time in weeks. Callahan's voice cracked. I just wanted to say thank you, if you hadn't been here. I'm glad I could help. Callahan nodded, cleared his throat, and turned to leave. Then he paused. If you need anything while you're in town, you let me know. I owe you. He left before Ruth could respond. Mrs. McKenna watched him go, then turned to Ruth with a look that might have been the closest thing to respect the woman was capable of. You know medicine? My mother was a healer. She taught me. A healer? Mrs. McKenna said the word like she was testing it. We got a doctor in town, but he's drunk more than he's sober. Might be folks could use someone who actually knows what they're doing. It wasn't an offer, just an observation, but Ruth heard the unspoken question underneath. Are you staying? She didn't know the answer yet. By midday, half the town knew what had happened. Ruth stepped outside to fetch water from the pump and found 3 women waiting near the boarding house fence. They looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, the way people always looked at strangers who did unexpected things. You're the one who saved the Callahan boy, one of them said. Not a question. I helped him breathe, that's all. Eliza Pruitt said you use steam and herbs. Just steam. The women exchanged glances. One of them, younger, with dark hair pinned under a bonnet, stepped forward. My daughter's got a cough that won't quit. Doctor gave her a tonic, but it ain't working. You think you could look at her? Ruth hesitated. I'm not a doctor. I ain't asking for a doctor. I'm asking if you know something that might help. There was desperation in the woman's voice, the kind Ruth recognized because she'd heard it in her own mother's patients back in Philadelphia. People who'd tried everything and were willing to gamble on a stranger. I can look, Ruth said quietly, but I can't make promises. The woman's face flooded with relief. That's all I'm asking. Can you come by this afternoon? Where do you live? 2 streets over, yellow house with the broken fence. Name's Ann Griffith. I'll be there. The women left, whispering among themselves, and Ruth stood alone by the pump, wondering what she'd just agreed to. Ann Griffith's house was small and cluttered, with laundry hanging across the main room and a wood stove that filled the air with smoke. The daughter, a girl maybe 5 years old, sat on a stool near the window, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Ruth knelt beside her. What's your name? Lily. Lily, I need to listen to your chest. Is that all right? The girl nodded. Ruth pressed her ear to the small ribcage and heard the rattle immediately. Deep and wet. The sound of fluid trapped in the lungs. Not consumption, not yet, but close. How long has she been coughing? Ruth asked. 3 weeks, Anne said. Started right after the rains. Ruth sat back. She needs to be kept dry and warm, and I can make a tea that'll help break up the congestion. What kind of tea? Ruth opened her bag and pulled out her mother's journal, a small leather-bound book filled with handwritten notes and remedies. She flipped to a page near the middle. Mullein leaf, thyme, and a bit of honey. Do you have access to those? I got thyme in the garden. Don't know about the rest. I'll find them. Ruth closed the journal. I'll bring the tea tomorrow morning. In the meantime, keep her near the stove. The warmth helps. Anne's eyes filled. How much do I owe you? Ruth thought about the $2 she had left, about the week she had before her room ran out. Nothing, she heard herself say. Just keep her warm. She left before the woman could argue. But that evening, Ruth walked to the general store and asked the shopkeeper if he carried mullein leaf. He stared at her. What the hell is that? It's an herb used for lung ailments. Lady, I sell flour and nails. I don't sell herbs. Ruth nodded and turned to leave. Wait. She looked back. The shopkeeper scratched his jaw. There's a fella north of town, runs a cattle ranch up in the hills. Wade Mercer. He's got land near the creek, and I've seen mullein growing wild out that way. If you're desperate enough to go looking, you might find some. How far north? Maybe 3 miles, but I wouldn't go alone if I were you. Mercer don't take kindly to visitors. Why not? The shopkeeper shrugged. Man lost his family a few years back. Ain't been right since. Keeps to himself. Don't talk to nobody. Ruth thanked him and walked back to the boarding house, her mind already working through the problem. 3 miles wasn't far. She could walk it in an hour if the terrain wasn't too rough. And if this Mercer didn't want visitors, she'd stay out of his way. She just needed the plant. She left before dawn while the town was still dark. The road north was little more than a dirt track cutting through scrub grass and sage. Ruth carried a cloth bag and wore her plainest dress, the one that wouldn't show dust. The air was cold enough to make her breath visible. She walked fast, keeping her eyes on the ground, watching for anything that looked like the sketches in her mother's journal. Mullein had broad, fuzzy leaves and grew in dry soil near water. If the shopkeeper was right about the creek, she'd find it. The sun rose behind her, turning the sky pink and gold. After an hour, she saw the creek, a thin line of water cutting through a shallow gulch. And there, growing in thick clusters along the bank, were the plants she needed. Ruth knelt and began picking leaves, working quickly. She filled her bag halfway before she heard the horse. She froze. The rider came over the rise to her left. A man on a massive bay horse, silhouetted against the morning light. He didn't say anything, just sat there watching. Ruth stood slowly, clutching her bag. I'm not trespassing. I'm just gathering herbs. The man didn't respond. He was big, broad-shouldered and tall, even sitting down. His hat shadowed his face, but she could see the line of his jaw and the way he held himself perfectly still, like he was carved from the same stone as the hills around them. I'll leave, Ruth said. I didn't mean to disturb you. The man's horse shifted, and he steadied it with one hand. Still, he didn't speak. Ruth turned and started walking back the way she'd come, her heart pounding. She made it maybe 20 yards before the sound of hooves followed. She didn't run. Running would be worse. The rider came alongside her, moving at a walk. Ruth kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at him. You're the one who saved the Callahan boy. His voice was low and rough, like he didn't use it much. Ruth glanced up. The man's face was hard and weathered, with deep lines around his eyes and a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He wasn't old, maybe 40, but he looked like he'd lived twice that. Yes, she said. You need more of that? He nodded at her bag. I do. The man studied her for a long moment. Then he dismounted, walked to the creek, and pulled up a dozen mullein plants by the roots, shaking off the dirt. He brought them back and held them out. Ruth stared. Thank you. He nodded once, swung back onto his horse, and rode away without another word. Ruth stood in the middle of the empty road, holding a bundle of herbs, and watched him disappear over the ridge. She didn't know his name, but something about the way he'd looked at her, like he saw past the fear and exhaustion to the person underneath, made her chest ache in a way she didn't expect. She walked back to town thinking about silence and the weight of grief and the strange kindness of men who didn't speak. By the end of the week, Ruth had treated 4 more patients. A ranch hand with an infected cut, a woman with headaches that wouldn't quit, a child with fever. Each time she used what her mother had taught her. Simple remedies, common sense, the kind of medicine that didn't require a degree but worked if you paid attention. People started calling her the healer. She didn't correct them, Mrs. McKenna stopped charging her for meals. "You're earning your keep," the older woman said. "Folks are talking. They're saying you're better than Doc Miller." Ruth didn't know if that was true, but she did know she was running out of money, and if people wanted to pay her in bread or firewood or the occasional coin, she wasn't going to refuse. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, but it was something. And for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, Ruth Calloway felt like maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she could survive. Winter came to Black Hollow like a fist. The first snow hit in late October, turning the dust to mud and the mud to ice. Ruth woke one morning to find frost on the inside of her window and her breath hanging visible in the air. She wrapped herself in both her shawls and went downstairs to find Mrs. McKenna stoking the fire in the dining room, her face grim. "Wood's running low," the older woman said without preamble. "I need another cord before the real cold hits, but Miller's charging double what he did last year. Highway robbery." Ruth poured herself coffee from the pot on the stove. It was weak and bitter, but it was hot. "How much does he want?" $8. I got 5, and that's only because the Hendersons paid their rent early. Mrs. McKenna jabbed at the fire with an iron poker. "Winter ain't even started yet, and we're already scraping bottom." Ruth thought about the $4 she'd managed to save from treating patients over the past month. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She'd been planning to use it for fabric to make a warmer dress. "I can chop wood," she heard herself say. Mrs. McKenna turned to look at her. "You ever chopped wood before?" "No, but I can learn." The older woman's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "There's an axe in the shed out back. If you're serious, the deadfall's been piling up behind the saloon. Nobody's touched it because it's hard work for no pay. But if you can split it, we can burn it." Ruth set down her coffee. "Show me where." An hour later, she stood in the alley behind the saloon staring at a pile of wood that looked like it had been dumped there and forgotten. Branches, logs, chunks of fence posts, all of it tangled together and half buried in snow. The axe in her hands weighed more than she'd expected. She swung. The blade glanced off the log and buried itself in the dirt. Her hand stung from the impact. She tried again. This time the axe stuck in the wood but didn't split it. By the third attempt, her arms were shaking and she still hadn't managed to break a single piece. "You're doing it wrong." Ruth spun around, nearly dropping the axe. The man from the creek stood 10 feet away, his horse tied to a post near the saloon. He watched her with the same unreadable expression he'd worn the first time they'd met. Not judging, just observing. Ruth wiped sweat from her forehead despite the cold. "I'm aware of that." He walked over, took the axe from her hands without asking, and positioned a log upright on the chopping block. "You're swinging from your arms. That's why you're tired." He raised the axe above his head, letting the weight of it hang for a moment. "Let gravity do the work. Just aim it." He brought the axe down in one smooth motion. The log split clean in half. He handed the axe back to her. "Try again." Ruth positioned another log, mimicking what she'd seen. She raised the axe, felt the weight of it, and let it drop. The log split. Not perfectly. One piece was bigger than the other, but it split. She looked up, surprised, and found the man watching her with something that might have been approval. "Keep your feet wider," he said, "and don't grip so tight. You'll get blisters." Then he untied his horse and rode away. Ruth stood there for a moment, holding the axe, watching him disappear around the corner. She still didn't know his name, but she was starting to understand that he was the kind of man who helped without expecting thanks and left before you could offer it. She turned back to the woodpile and got to work. By sunset, she'd split half a cord. Her hands were raw and her back screamed, but the pile of firewood beside her was real and useful and hers. Mrs. McKenna came out to inspect the work, eyebrows raised. "Well, I'll be damned." Ruth couldn't help the small flicker of pride. "Will it be enough?" "For a few weeks, if we're careful." The older woman hesitated, then added, "You did good." That night, Ruth soaked her blistered hands in warm salt water and tried not to think about how much they hurt. Across the table, Tom Callahan's boy, fully recovered now and louder than ever, was arguing with another child about who could eat faster. The boarding house felt warmer than usual, and Ruth realized it was because of the fire she'd made possible. It was a small thing, but it mattered. She flexed her fingers, testing the soreness, and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before the exhaustion pulled her under. The next morning, she woke to find a stack of split firewood piled neatly beside the boarding house back door. Enough to last a month, maybe more. The pieces were uniform and expertly cut, the work of someone who'd been doing it his whole life. There was no note, no explanation. But Ruth knew. She stood in the cold dawn light, staring at the wood, and felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Not gratitude exactly, something deeper, something that felt like being seen. She didn't know what to do with that feeling, so she carried an armload inside and started breakfast. The weeks blurred together after that. Ruth fell into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like living. She treated patients in the mornings, coughs, cuts, fevers, the endless small ailments of a hard-working town. In the afternoons, she helped Mrs. McKenna with the boarding house work, scrubbing floors and washing linens and serving meals to men who were starting to nod at her when she walked by. Black Hollow was beginning to feel less hostile, not welcoming exactly, but familiar. She learned the rhythms of the town, which days the supply wagons came in, which families had money and which were barely scraping by, who drank too much and who worked too hard, and who could be trusted. She also learned about Wade Mercer. It started with Tom Callahan, who mentioned him one evening over supper. Mercer's horse went lame. Saw him leading her into town this morning. Looked bad. Mercer? Ruth asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. Owns the big ranch north of here. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's got the best horses in the territory. If something's wrong with that mare, it's going to hurt him bad. She's worth more than most men make in a year. Ruth thought about the silent man who'd taught her to split wood, who'd left enough firewood to last through winter without a word. She finished her meal and went to find Sheriff Hobson. He was in his office, boots up on his desk, reading a week-old newspaper. He looked up when she knocked. Miss Calloway? I heard Wade Mercer's horse is injured. Hobson's eyebrows went up. Word travels fast. Yeah, he brought her into Doc Miller this morning. But Miller's a people doctor, not a horse doctor, and he's drunk besides. Told Mercer there wasn't nothing he could do. What's wrong with the horse? Something with her leg. Swelled up bad. Can't put weight on it. Hobson folded his newspaper. Mercer's probably going to have to put her down. Shame, too. That mare's gotten him through some rough country. Ruth's mind was already working. Where is he now? Probably headed back to his ranch. Why? She didn't answer. She was already walking toward the door. Miss Calloway, Hobson called after her. Mercer don't take kindly to folks showing up unannounced. I'm not folks, Ruth said. I'm the healer. She borrowed a horse from Tom Callahan, a sweet-tempered gelding named Brick, who didn't mind the 3-mile walk north. The sun was high and cold, the kind of light that made everything look sharp-edged and brittle. Mercer's ranch appeared gradually over the hills, a house, a barn, corrals stretching out toward the tree line. It was bigger than she'd expected, but empty in a way that had nothing to do with size. No smoke from the chimney, no movement in the yard, just buildings standing quiet against the snow. She tied Brick to the fence and walked toward the barn. Wade Mercer stood inside next to a stall where a beautiful chestnut mare lay on her side, breathing hard. The horse's left foreleg was swollen to twice its normal size, the skin tight and hot-looking. Mercer looked up when Ruth's shadow fell across the threshold. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. A subtle tension, like he was bracing for bad news. Mr. Mercer, Ruth said, I heard your horse is hurt. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the mare. Nothing to be done. May I look at her? You a horse doctor? No, but I know about swelling and infection, and I know about pain. Mercer's jaw tightened. He didn't tell her to leave, which Ruth took as permission. She knelt beside the mare, who watched her with frightened, rolling eyes. Ruth placed a hand gently on the horse's neck, speaking soft and low. Easy, girl. Just going to look. The mare's breathing slowed slightly. Ruth ran her hands carefully down the injured leg, feeling for heat and checking the swelling. It was worst around the knee and fetlock, tight, angry, radiating warmth. But there was no break, no bone sticking out, just inflammation, severe and painful. What happened? She asked. Stepped wrong coming down a hill 2 days ago, Mercer said. Thought it was just a strain. Got worse overnight. Ruth sat back on her heels thinking. Her mother had treated horses a few times. Farmers who couldn't afford a veterinarian and were desperate enough to try anything. The principles were the same as treating people. Reduce the swelling, manage the pain, prevent infection. I can help her, Ruth said, but I'll need supplies. Mercer's eyes sharpened. What kind of supplies? Cold water, clean cloths, comfrey root if you have it, or I can use willow bark. And patience. How long? A few hours for the first treatment, then we'll see. Mercer studied her the way he'd studied the woodpile that first day, carefully, like he was trying to figure out if she was serious or foolish. Finally, he nodded. I'll get the water. They worked in silence. Mercer brought bucket after bucket of cold creek water while Ruth prepared compresses soaked in willow bark tea. She wrapped the mare's leg carefully, changing the cloths every 20 minutes to keep them cold. The horse flinched at first, then gradually relaxed as the cold numbed the worst of the pain. Ruth kept one hand on the mare's neck the whole time, talking to her in a low voice. Nonsense, mostly. Soothing sounds that seemed to calm the animal. Mercer watched from the corner of the stall, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. After 2 hours, the swelling had noticeably decreased. The mare's breathing was easier. She even tried to lift her head. Ruth sat back, exhausted. Her knees ached from kneeling on the barn floor and her hands were numb from the cold water. She needs to stay off the leg for at least a week, Ruth said. Keep the compresses cold and change them twice a day. The swelling should keep going down. If it gets worse or if she develops a fever, come find me. Mercer looked at his horse, then at Ruth. Why'd you come out here? The question caught her off guard. I heard she was hurt. That ain't an answer. Ruth stood, brushing straw from her skirt. She was too tired to be anything but honest. You left firewood at the boarding house, enough to last through winter. I wanted to repay the kindness. Something flickered across Mercer's face. Surprise, maybe, or discomfort. He looked away. Didn't need repaying. I know, but I needed to do it anyway. They stood there as a quiet barn, the mare breathing softly between them, and Ruth felt the weight of all the unspoken things that lived in the spaces people didn't talk about. Grief, loneliness, the strange ache of being helped by someone who expected nothing in return. Mercer cleared his throat. I'll ride you back. I have a horse. Then I'll make sure you get home safe. It wasn't a request. They rode back to Black Hollow side by side, not speaking. The sun was setting behind them, turning the snow pink and gold. Ruth's borrowed horse plodded along peacefully, while Mercer's big bay moved with the easy gait of an animal that had covered this ground 1,000 times. As they reached the edge of town, Mercer finally spoke. What's your name? Ruth Calloway. Wade Mercer. I know. He glanced at her, something almost like amusement in his eyes. Course you do. Small town. They stopped in front of the boarding house. Ruth dismounted, her legs stiff from the cold ride. Thank you for letting me help, she said. Wade nodded once. Then he turned his horse and rode back into the gathering dark. Ruth stood watching until he disappeared, then went inside where it was warm. Over the next week, the mare recovered. Ruth rode out to check on her twice, and each time she found the swelling reduced and the horse moving better. Wade didn't say much during these visits, just showed her the progress and listened when she gave instructions. But on her third visit, she found the barn swept clean and a pot of coffee waiting on the stove in the house. Wade poured her a cup without asking if she wanted one, and they sat at his kitchen table while snow fell outside the window. How long you been in Black Hollow? He asked. 2 months? You stayin'? Ruth wrapped her hands around the warm mug. I don't know yet. I came here for a job that didn't exist. Now I'm just here. Doing good work, from what I hear. People talk. Always do. Wade stared into his coffee. They talk about me too. Ruth waited, sensing he had more to say. I had a wife, he said finally, and a son. Fever took them both 4 years ago. Happened fast. 1 week they were fine, the next they were gone. His voice was flat, empty of inflection. Doc Miller couldn't do nothing. Nobody could. I'm sorry. Ain't looking for sympathy. Just explaining why I live the way I do. People think I'm unfriendly. Truth is, I just don't have much to say anymore. Ruth understood that. The silence that came after loss. the way words felt insufficient. "I lost my mother last year," she said, "and my father before that. Different circumstances, but the result's the same. You wake up one day and everyone you loved is gone." Wade looked at her then, really looked, and Ruth saw recognition in his eyes, the kind that came from shared experience. "That why you came west?" he asked. "Partly. Also because I didn't have anywhere else to go. And now? Now I'm chopping firewood and treating coughs and trying to figure out what comes next." Wade's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. That's more than most people manage. They sat in comfortable silence after that, drinking coffee and watching the snow. Ruth noticed things about the house that she hadn't seen before. The dust on the shelves, the cold fireplace, the sense of a place that had stopped being a home and become just a building where someone slept. "You should light a fire," she said. "It's freezing in here." "Don't see the point. I'm usually in the barn." "The point is not dying of cold in your own house." Wade looked at her, startled, and then he actually smiled. It transformed his face, made him look younger and less burdened. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and got up to build a fire. Ruth rode back to town that afternoon, thinking about loneliness and the different shapes it took. Wade Mercer lived alone on a ranch full of ghosts, while she lived in a boarding house full of strangers. Neither situation was what they'd chosen, but maybe both of them were learning how to survive it. As winter deepened, Ruth found herself riding out to Mercer's ranch more often than necessary. She told herself it was to check on the mare, who was fully healed now and moving sound. But the truth was that she liked the quiet of the place, liked the way Wade didn't fill the silence with empty words, liked the way he made coffee without asking if she wanted it, and handed her tools without explaining what they were for, trusting she'd figure it out. They worked together sometimes, her helping with small tasks around the ranch, him showing her how things were done. He taught her to mend fence, to read weather in the sky, to tell when a horse was favoring a leg before it went lame. She taught him about herbs and healing, about the way willow bark could reduce fever and how chamomile helped people sleep. They didn't talk about the past much, but sometimes Wade would mention his son, how the boy had loved horses, how he'd been fearless in a way that terrified his parents. And Ruth would tell stories about her mother, about the patients they'd treated together, about the satisfaction of watching someone heal. The people of Black Hollow noticed. Ruth heard the whispers at the general store, saw the looks when she rode through town on her borrowed horse. The healer and the hermit, the outsider and the widower. People had opinions about what it meant, this strange friendship growing between two people who didn't quite fit. Most of the opinions were harmless curiosity, but some carried an edge of disapproval that Ruth couldn't quite understand. It was Mrs. McKenna who finally explained it. They were hanging laundry in the frozen yard behind the boarding house, their breath steaming in the cold air, when the older woman said, "You've been spending a lot of time at the Mercer Ranch." Ruth pinned a sheet to the line. "Wade's mare needed treatment. Mare's been healed for weeks. There's other work to be done." Mrs. McKenna gave her a long look. "I ain't your mother, and I ain't going to tell you how to live, but you should know that people are talking, and some of 'em ain't kind about it." Ruth's hand stilled on the laundry. "What are they saying?" "That you're chasing after a rich rancher, that you're trying to get your hooks in him before someone else does." Heat flooded Ruth's face. "That's not—" "I know it ain't, but folks see what they want to see. And a young woman spending time alone with a man like Wade Mercer, well, it don't look innocent. Not in a town like this." Ruth grabbed another sheet, snapping it hard to shake out the wrinkles. "I'm helping a friend. Maybe so, but the Voss family ain't going to see it that way." "The Voss family?" Mrs. McKenna's expression darkened. "Eleanor Voss runs the biggest ranch east of here with her brother. She's had her eye on Wade Mercer for years. Thinks she's going to be the one to bring him back into society. Seeing you out there instead of her, well, that ain't going to sit well." Ruth had heard the name before. Eleanor Voss. The woman owned half the businesses in Black Hollow and treated the town like her personal kingdom. Ruth had seen her once from a distance, elegant and cold, dressed in clothes that cost more than most families made in a year. "I'm not interested in Wade Mercer's money," Ruth said quietly. "I know, but Eleanor Voss is, and she's got the kind of power that can make life real difficult for people she don't like." That night, Ruth lay awake thinking about power and perception and the way people twisted things to fit the stories they wanted to believe. She thought about riding out to Wade's ranch and ending the friendship before it caused problems. But then she thought about the way he'd taught her to swing an axe, the way he'd left firewood without asking for thanks, the way he listened when she talked about her mother, like the stories mattered. She wasn't going to let Eleanor Voss take that away. The confrontation came 2 weeks later. Ruth was in the general store buying flour when Eleanor Voss walked in with 2 women trailing behind her like attendants. She was tall and beautiful in a way that felt calculated. Perfect posture, perfect hair, perfect dress that whispered money with every movement. She saw Ruth immediately. "You're Miss Calloway," Eleanor said. Not a question, a statement. Ruth set the flour on the counter. "I am. I've heard so much about you. The healer who saved the Callahan boy. How extraordinary." Eleanor's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Though I must say, I'm surprised to hear you've been spending so much time at the Mercer Ranch. Wade is such a private person. He rarely accepts visitors." The other women watched with hungry interest. Ruth met Eleanor's gaze steadily. "He needed help with an injured horse." "Of course, and that would explain one visit, perhaps 2, but I understand you've been out there quite regularly." Eleanor tilted her head. "People might get the wrong idea about such frequent visits. A young woman, alone with a wealthy rancher. You can see how it might look. Improper." The shopkeeper was pretending to organize shelves while clearly listening to every word. Ruth kept her voice level. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Voss, but my relationship with Mr. Mercer is none of your business." Eleanor's smile sharpened. "Everything in Black Hollow is my business, Miss Calloway. My family built this town. We own most of the land, including the property where your boarding house sits. So when I see someone new trying to position themselves with one of our prominent citizens, I take notice. I'm not positioning myself anywhere. I'm helping a friend." "A friend?" Eleanor's laugh was like cut glass. "How quaint, though I wonder what kind of help Wade really needs from someone like you." "Someone like you." The words hung in the air, loaded with implication. Ruth felt her temper rising but forced it down. Getting angry would only prove whatever point Eleanor was trying to make. "Is there something specific you wanted to say to me, Mrs. Voss?" Eleanor stepped closer, dropping her voice so only Ruth could hear. "I'm saying that you should be very careful about the company you keep and the reputations you try to build. Black Hollow is a small town. Rumors spread. And I'd hate to see your little healing business suffer because people started questioning your character." It was a threat, clear and unmistakable. Ruth held her ground. "Thank you for the advice." She paid for her flour, walked out of the store, and didn't let herself shake until she was back at the boarding house. Mrs. McKenna took one look at her face and poured her a cup of tea. "Eleanor got to you." Ruth nodded. "What'd she say?" "That I should stay away from Wade, that people are talking, that my business might suffer if I don't." Ruth wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "She basically threatened me. That's Eleanor's way. She don't like competition. I'm not competing for anything." "You sure about that?" Ruth looked up sharply. Mrs. McKenna raised her hands. "I ain't saying you're chasing him, but I seen the way you look when you come back from that ranch. Lighter, somehow, happier, and I seen the way he looks at you when he rides through town. Like he's checking to make sure you're still here. That ain't just friendship, girl, and Eleanor Voss ain't blind." Ruth set down her teacup. "It doesn't matter what it is. I'm not going to let her bully me into giving up the one good thing I've found in this place." "Then you better be ready for what comes next, because Eleanor don't make threats she can't back up." 3 days later, Ruth's first patient canceled. Then another. By the end of the week, half her regular appointments were gone. When she asked why, people looked away and mumbled excuses. Too busy. Feeling better. Decided to try Doc Miller instead. Ruth knew what was happening. Eleanor Voss was making good on her threat. She kept working, kept treating the people who would still see her, kept chopping wood and helping at the boarding house. But the money dried up. And without the money, she was back where she'd started, counting coins and wondering how long she could last. She didn't tell Wade. She couldn't. The man had enough problems without adding hers to the pile. But Wade noticed anyway. He showed up at the boarding house one evening in early December, his hat in his hands, snow melting in his hair. Mrs. McKenna led him into the dining room where Ruth was setting tables for supper. "Need to talk to you," he said. They stepped outside into the cold. Ruth wrapped her shawl tighter. "Heard you been losing patience," Wade said. Ruth looked away. "Word travels. Eleanor Voss? How did you—" "Because that's what she does. Someone threatens her position, she cuts them down." Wade's jaw was tight. "This is my fault." "It's not." "It is. She's had her eye on my land for years. Thinks if she can get me to marry her, she'll control the whole North Territory. Seeing you out there messed up her plans." Ruth laughed bitterly. "I'm not even trying to mess up anything. I'm just trying to survive." "I know. That's why I'm going to fix it." "How?" Wade looked at her, and Ruth saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Determination. Maybe even anger. "By telling the whole town exactly what I think of Eleanor Voss and her threats. By making it clear that anyone who refuses to see you will answer to me." "Wade, you can't." "I can and I will. I'm done letting people like her run roughshod over decent folks just because they got money." He stepped closer. "You saved my horse. You've helped half this town get through sickness. You work harder than anyone I know, and I'll be damned if I let Eleanor Voss destroy you because she's jealous." Ruth's throat tightened. "You don't have to do this, do." "Yeah, I do." Wade's voice softened. "You're the first person in 4 years who treated me like I was still human, who didn't tiptoe around my grief or try to fix me. You just showed up and kept showing up. That means something." Ruth didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. Wade put his hat back on. "I'm heading out on a cattle drive in 2 days, be gone about 3 weeks. But when I get back, we're settling this." He left before she could respond. Ruth stood in the snow, watching him ride away, and felt something shift inside her chest. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. But hope was a luxury she'd learned not to trust. Wade left before dawn 2 days later, leading a string of cattle south with 4 other ranchers. Ruth watched from the boarding house window as the procession moved through town. Men bundled against the cold, horses breathing steam, the cattle lowing and shifting in the pre-dawn darkness. She didn't go outside, didn't wave, but she watched until the last rider disappeared beyond the edge of town. Then she went downstairs and started breakfast. The first week without Wade passed quietly. Ruth treated the few patients who still came to her, mostly people too poor to care what Eleanor Voss thought, or too desperate to let pride get in the way of healing. She chopped wood. She helped Mrs. McKenna scrub floors and wash linens. She kept her head down and tried not to think about how precarious her situation had become. But on the 8th day, everything changed. Ruth was carrying water from the pump when she saw Eleanor Voss step out of the sheriff's office with Sheriff Hobson beside her. They were deep in conversation, Eleanor's voice too low to hear, but her expression sharp and focused. Hobson looked uncomfortable, nodding along to whatever she was saying. Ruth's stomach tightened. Nothing good came from Eleanor spending time with the law. She hurried back to the boarding house, sloshing water over the sides of the bucket. Mrs. McKenna was in the kitchen kneading bread, her capable hands working the dough with practiced efficiency. She looked up when Ruth came in. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Eleanor Voss was with the sheriff. Mrs. McKenna's hands stilled. "That ain't good." "What could she possibly want with him?" "Nothing legal, that's for sure. Eleanor don't talk to Hobson unless she's got a problem she wants solved her way." The older woman shaped the dough into a loaf and set it aside to rise. "Whatever she's planning, it ain't going to be small." Ruth set the water bucket down harder than necessary. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Don't matter. Eleanor don't need you to do something wrong. She just needs people to believe you did." The words settled over Ruth like ice water. That afternoon, the whispers started. Ruth heard them at the general store, in the gaps between conversations when she walked past. Saw them in the way people looked at her, and then quickly looked away. By evening, the rumors had taken shape. Her father had been a criminal back east, a thief. She'd fled to avoid prosecution. The whole governess story was a lie. She'd come to Black Hollow to hide from the law. Ruth stood in the middle of the boarding house dining room, hands shaking, while Mrs. McKenna recounted what she'd heard. "Is any of it true?" the older woman asked quietly. Ruth's throat closed. "My father, he did steal money. He was caught. He killed himself before the trial ended. But I didn't know what he was doing. I wasn't part of it." But you ran. I didn't run. I left because there was nothing left for me in Philadelphia. No family, no friends, no future. Ruth's voice cracked. I came here to start over. That's not a crime. Mrs. McKenna studied her face for a long moment. Then she nodded. I believe you. But it don't matter what I believe. It matters what the town believes. And Eleanor's good at making people believe what she wants. How did she even find out? Money buys information. Eleanor probably hired someone to dig into your past the moment she saw you as a threat. Mrs. McKenna's expression was grim. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Ruth didn't have an answer. Over the next 3 days, the town turned against her completely. The few remaining patients stopped coming. People crossed the street to avoid her. The shopkeeper refused to sell to her on credit. Even Tom Callahan, whose son Ruth had saved, wouldn't meet her eyes when they passed on the street. Ruth felt the walls closing in. Mrs. McKenna did what she could. She let Ruth keep her room even though there was no money to pay for it. She made sure Ruth had food. She stood beside her when the whispers grew loud enough to hear. But even Mrs. McKenna had limits. I got a business to run, she said one morning, her voice heavy with regret. And folks are starting to talk about not staying here because you're under this roof. I can give you another week, maybe 2. But after that, she didn't finish. She didn't have to. Ruth nodded, swallowing past the lump in her throat. I understand. That night she pulled out her trunk and started packing. There wasn't much. She'd arrived with almost nothing and hadn't accumulated much more. 3 dresses, her mother's journal, the photograph she still couldn't bring herself to burn, and the letter from Joshua Farrell that had brought her here in the first place. She stared at it for a long time, this piece of paper that had promised her a new life and delivered only more shame. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it into the journal. Tomorrow she'd go to the train station and ask about tickets. She had maybe $5 left, enough to get her partway to somewhere else. Somewhere nobody knew her father's name or cared about her past. Somewhere she could disappear. She lay awake that night listening to the wind howl against the boarding house walls and tried not to think about Wade Mercer coming back to find her gone. Tried not to imagine his face when he learned what had happened. Tried not to feel like she was abandoning the one person who'd looked at her and seen something worth defending. But survival meant making hard choices. And Ruth had learned long ago that staying somewhere you weren't wanted only led to more pain. In the morning, she'd leave, before the town could push her out, before Mrs. McKenna had to choose between her business and a doomed friendship, before whatever was growing between her and Wade could become something that hurt worse than everything else combined. She fell asleep just before dawn, her decision made. The knock on her door came at sunrise. Ruth jerked awake, disoriented and groggy. She'd barely slept 3 hours. Miss Calloway? It was Mrs. McKenna, her voice urgent. You need to come downstairs. Ruth pulled on her shawl and opened the door. What's wrong? Wade Mercer just rode in. He's looking for you. Ruth's heart stopped. He's supposed to be gone for 3 weeks. Well, he ain't. He's downstairs and he looks like hell. Mrs. McKenna's expression was unreadable. Whatever you two got between you, it ain't simple. Ruth followed her down to the dining room where Wade stood near the window, still wearing his trail clothes, his face haggard with exhaustion and several days' worth of beard. His eyes found hers immediately. Ruth. She'd never heard him say her name before. It did something to her chest she wasn't prepared for. What are you doing back? The cattle drive is being handled by the others. I came back early. He looked at Mrs. McKenna. Can we talk? Alone? The older woman nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. Wade waited until she was gone, then turned to Ruth. I heard what happened. All of it. Ruth's stomach dropped. How? Ran into a freight driver 2 days south of here. He was carrying gossip along with his cargo. Said the whole town was talking about how Eleanor Voss exposed some criminal woman hiding out as a healer. Wade's jaw tightened. Took me about 5 seconds to figure out who he meant. So you rode back? Of course I rode back. He said it like it was obvious, like there was no other possible choice. I told you I was going to fix this. I meant it. Ruth shook her head. You can't fix this, Wade. Eleanor found out about my father, about what he did, and she's made sure everyone in Black Hollow knows I'm the daughter of a thief and a suicide. That's not something you can argue away. Then we don't argue. We tell the truth. The truth is that my father was a criminal, that I come from shame, that everywhere I go his crimes follow me. Ruth's voice broke. Eleanor didn't lie. She just twisted facts until they looked the way she wanted. Wade crossed the room in 3 strides and gripped her shoulders. Listen to me. I don't give a damn what your father did. I care about what you've done. And what you've done is save lives and work yourself half to death and show more courage than anyone in this town. That's who you are, not him. Tears burned Ruth's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. It doesn't matter who I am. It matters what people believe. And they believe I'm not worth trusting. Then they're fools. Maybe. But they're fools with power, and I'm just... She stopped, the words catching in her throat. Just what? Nobody. I'm nobody, Wade. I have no family, no money, no position. Eleanor Voss can destroy me without even trying because I have nothing to fight back with. Wade's hands tightened on her shoulders. You got me. The words hung between them, raw and honest. Ruth looked up at him. At this man who'd ridden through 2 days and nights to get back to her, who'd left his cattle and his ranch and his carefully maintained solitude because someone had hurt her. Why? She whispered. Why do you care what happens to me? Wade's expression softened in a way she'd never seen before. Because for the first time in 4 years, I don't feel dead inside when I'm around you. Because you look at me like I'm still a person instead of a tragedy. Because... He stopped, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easy. Because you matter, to me. And I ain't gonna let Eleanor Voss take that away. Ruth's breath caught. Before she could respond, the door burst open and Tom Callahan stumbled in, his face white with panic. Miss Calloway, please. It's my boy again. He can't breathe and I don't know what to do, and Ruth was already moving. She grabbed her medicine bag from where it hung near the door and followed Callahan out into the street, Wade right behind her. They ran 3 blocks to the Callahan house, Ruth's skirts tangling around her legs, her breath coming in gasps. Inside, she found the boy on the floor, his mother holding him while he struggled for air, his lips already turning blue. Ruth dropped to her knees. How long? 5 minutes, maybe more. I sent Tom for you, but... Get me hot water, now! She worked quickly, using the same method she'd used the first time. Steam and heat and calm reassurance. But this attack was worse. The boy's airway was almost completely closed. His small body was rigid with panic. Come on, Ruth murmured, adjusting the steam tent. Come on, breathe. Nothing. The boy's eyes were starting to roll back. Ruth made a split-second decision. She tilted his head further back, opening his throat at a sharper angle, and pressed her fingers to either side of his windpipe, feeling for the constriction. What are you doing? Wade asked quietly from behind her. Trying to manually open the airway. Her fingers found the spot where the swelling was worst. She applied gentle, steady pressure, working against the inflammation. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then the boy gasped. A wet, rattling sound. And air moved. Ruth kept the pressure steady, kept talking to him in a low voice, kept the steam flowing. Gradually, achingly slowly, his breathing improved. The blue faded from his lips. His body began to relax. By the time he was breathing normally again, Ruth's hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the cloth. Tom Callahan was crying openly. His wife had her face buried in her hands. Ruth sat back exhausted. He needs to see a real doctor, someone who knows more than I do about this condition. There ain't no doctor better than you, Tom said hoarsely. You saved him. Again. I got lucky. Next time I might not. Ruth looked at the boy's mother. There are doctors in Denver who specialize in breathing problems. You should take him there. We can't afford Denver. Then we figure something out, but he can't keep having these attacks without proper treatment. Wade spoke from the doorway. I'll pay for it. Everyone turned to look at him. You'll what? Tom asked. I'll pay for the trip to Denver, and the doctor, and whatever treatment he needs. Wade's voice was firm. That boy deserves a chance at a normal life, and Miss Calloway deserves not to carry the weight of saving him every time his lungs decide to quit. Tom stared at Wade like he'd grown a second head. I can't let you do that. You can and you will. I got the money and you need the help. That's the end of it. Tom looked at his wife, who nodded through her tears. Thank you, Tom whispered. I don't know how to... Don't thank me. Thank her. Wade nodded at Ruth. She's the one who keeps pulling miracles out of thin air. They left the Callahan house together, Ruth's bag heavy in her hand, the morning sun just starting to burn through the clouds. People had gathered in the street, drawn by the commotion. They watched in silence as Ruth and Wade walked past. Ruth saw their faces, the same faces that had turned away from her for the past 2 weeks, saw the uncertainty there, the doubt creeping in around the edges of Eleanor's carefully constructed narrative, because they'd just watched her save a child's life, again, and that was harder to ignore than rumors about a father she'd never defended. Wade walked her back to the boarding house, neither of them speaking, but when they reached the door, he stopped her with a hand on her arm. "I'm riding out to confront Eleanor today." Ruth's stomach clenched. "Wade, don't. She'll just what? Spread more lies? She already done her worst. Now it's my turn." His expression was hard. "I'm going to make it real clear that anyone who does business with the Voss family ain't doing business with me, and I'm going to tell the whole town exactly why. You'll make an enemy of the most powerful family in the territory." "Good. Been needing some enemies to remind me I'm still alive." Ruth wanted to argue, wanted to tell him it wasn't worth it, that she'd already decided to leave, that he shouldn't burn bridges for someone who was just passing through. But the words wouldn't come. Because part of her, the part that had been running for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand still, wanted to see what would happen if someone actually fought for her. Wade seemed to read the conflict in her face. "You're thinking about leaving?" It wasn't a question. Ruth looked away. "I have a trunk packed upstairs." "Don't. Wade, don't run. Not yet. Give me a chance to fix this first." He ducked his head to catch her eyes. "Please." Ruth had never heard him say please before. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Wade squeezed her arm once, then turned and walked toward where his horse was tied. Ruth watched him mount up and ride east toward the Voss ranch and felt her heart climb into her throat. Mrs. McKenna appeared beside her. "That man's either the bravest fool I ever met, or he's in love with you. He barely knows me." "Sometimes that's all it takes." Mrs. McKenna handed her a cup of coffee. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Ruth didn't have an answer. Wade returned 3 hours later. Ruth saw him ride past the boarding house window, his face like granite, and her stomach dropped. She found him at the saloon standing at the bar with a whiskey he hadn't touched. The place was half full with afternoon drinkers who'd all gone quiet when he walked in. "What happened?" Ruth asked quietly. Wade stared at his glass. "Told Eleanor exactly what I thought of her and her poison. Told her I'd make sure every rancher between here and the state line knew what kind of woman she really was. Told her that anyone who chose her business over basic human decency could go to hell." "What did she say?" "That I was making a mistake. That defending a criminal's daughter would ruin my reputation. That I'd lose friends, lose business, lose everything." Wade finally looked at her. "Then she told me something else." Ruth's chest tightened. "What?" "She said she's got proof your father didn't just steal from banks. He stole from people. Regular folks who trusted him with their savings. Families who lost everything because of what he did." Wade's voice was careful. "She said she's got letters from his victims, and she's going to make sure everyone in Black Hollow reads them." The room spun. Ruth gripped the edge of the bar to steady herself. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know it was that bad." "I know you didn't. But it doesn't matter, does it? Because those people existed. They suffered, and I'm his daughter." Her voice was hollow. "I'm the daughter of a man who destroyed lives." Wade turned to face her fully. "You ain't responsible for what he did. Tell that to his victims." "I would if they were here, but they ain't. Eleanor is. And she's using dead people's pain to hurt you because she's cruel and petty and can't stand that I'd rather spend time with someone real than someone made of money and lies." Ruth shook her head. "This is exactly what I was trying to avoid. This is why I should have left when I had the chance. But you didn't leave. You stayed. You fought. You saved that boy's life this morning, even though half this town's been treating you like dirt." Wade's voice dropped. "That takes more courage than running ever could." "It's not courage, it's stupidity. It's both, but mostly it's courage." Someone cleared their throat behind them. Ruth turned to find Sheriff Hobson standing in the saloon doorway, his hat in his hands. "Miss Calloway, Mr. Mercer, need to talk to both of you." Wade's expression went cold. "If Eleanor sent you—" "She didn't." "Well, she did, but I ain't here on her business." Hobson looked uncomfortable. "Can we step outside?" They followed him into the street where a small crowd had already gathered. Word traveled fast in Black Hollow. Hobson pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I got a telegram this morning from the marshal in Denver about Joshua Farrell." Ruth's breath caught. "They found him?" "They found him. He's been in jail there for the past 2 months, arrested for fraud and theft. Turns out he's been running a scheme across 3 territories, advertising for governesses and housekeepers, collecting their travel money, then disappearing before they arrived." Hobson's face was grim. "You weren't the only one, Miss Calloway. There were at least 8 other women." The world tilted. Ruth grabbed Wade's arm to steady herself. 8? Maybe more. The marshal's still investigating." Hobson looked at her with something that might have been respect. "Most of those women didn't make it. They ran out of money, couldn't find work, ended up— well, let's just say you're luckier than you know." "Lucky," Ruth repeated numbly. "What I'm saying is you came here under false pretenses just like all the others. But unlike them, you survived. You made something of yourself. And—" Hobson cleared his throat. "Eleanor Voss may have found out about your father, but she left out the part where you were a victim too. That seems important." Wade's hand covered Ruth's where it gripped his arm. "Does Eleanor know about Farrell?" "She does now. I made sure to tell her." Hobson almost smiled. Figured she'd want to know the whole story, seeing as how she's been so concerned with the truth lately. It was a small victory, barely anything at all in the face of everything else. But it was something. That evening, 2 families who'd stopped seeing Ruth showed up at the boarding house asking for treatment. She saw them both, accepted their awkward apologies, and pretended not to notice the way they still looked at her with doubt lurking behind their gratitude. Progress was slow, but it was progress. Wade stayed in town instead of riding back to his ranch. He rented a room at the boarding house, ignoring Mrs. McKenna's raised eyebrows, and made it clear he wasn't going anywhere until things settled. "You don't have to do this," Ruth told him that night as they sat on the boarding house porch, watching snow fall in the darkness. "Yeah, I do. Your ranch has survived me being gone before. It'll survive a few more days." Wade leaned back in his chair. "Besides, I like it here." Ruth looked at him. "You like a drafty boarding house full of strangers?" "I like being somewhere you are." The words settled between them, simple and devastating. Ruth didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to process the fact that this quiet, broken man had decided she was worth defending, worth staying for, worth risking everything he'd carefully built in his isolation. "I'm still leaving eventually," she said quietly. "You know that, right? Even if Eleanor backs down, even if the town accepts me again, I can't stay here forever. There's too much weight in the past." Wade was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Maybe, but you're here now. That's enough." Ruth wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that now could be enough, that the future could wait, that 2 people carrying grief and shame could build something solid in the empty spaces between their losses. But she'd learned not to trust wanting, so she sat in silence beside him, watching snow cover the town, and tried not to think about how much it would hurt when she finally had to leave. The storm hit 3 days later, rolling in from the west like the end of the world. Ruth woke to the sound of wind screaming against the boarding house walls and rain hammering the roof so hard she thought it might cave in. Lightning cracked across the sky, turning everything white for a fraction of a second before plunging the world back into darkness. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Mrs. McKenna already up, moving through the kitchen with a lamp in one hand. "This is going to be bad," the older woman said without preamble. "I've seen storms like this before. They don't quit easy." By noon, half the town was flooded. Water poured down the main street and rivers, carrying debris and trash with it. The saloon's roof started leaking. 3 houses lost their shutters to the wind. And somewhere north of town, lightning struck a tree near the railroad tracks and sent it crashing across the line. Wade came in soaked to the bone, his hat dripping water. "Bridge is out." Ruth looked up from where she was helping Mrs. McKenna move supplies away from the leaking ceiling. "What bridge?" "The railroad bridge, 5 miles east, Whole center section collapsed. He shook water from his coat. Train was supposed to come through this afternoon. Had to turn back. Ruth's stomach dropped. She'd bought a ticket for that train 2 days ago, before Wade convinced her to wait. If she'd left when she'd planned, she'd be stranded somewhere between Black Hollow and the next town, stuck on a train that couldn't go forward or back. Wade saw her face. "You okay?" "I almost left," she said quietly. "I almost got on that train." "But you didn't." "Only because you asked me to stay." Something passed between them. An acknowledgement of how close she'd come to disappearing, how fragile the thread was that kept her here. Mrs. McKenna broke the moment. "Wade, if that bridge is out, we got bigger problems. Supplies come in on that train, medicine too." "I know. Hobson's already sent in riders to the next town to see if they can bring wagons around by road. But with this storm, it's going to be days before anything gets through." Ruth thought about her dwindling supply of herbs and remedies, about the patients who depended on regular medicine, about what would happen if someone got seriously sick before help arrived. The storm raged through the afternoon and into the evening. By the time night fell, the whole town was hunkered down, waiting for it to pass. Ruth lay awake listening to the wind and thinking about trains and bridges and all the ways fate intervened when you weren't paying attention. She'd been so close to running, so close to vanishing back into the anonymity she'd been chasing since leaving Philadelphia. But Wade had asked her to stay. And she had. She didn't know yet if that made her brave or just foolish. The rain finally stopped just before dawn, leaving the town mud-soaked and battered. Ruth stepped outside to survey the damage and found the street transformed into a swamp. Broken boards floated in puddles. A wagon sat tilted in a ditch, one wheel missing. People emerged from their houses slowly, looking dazed. That's when the scream cut through the morning air. Ruth ran toward the sound, her boots splashing through mud, and found a crowd gathering near the town well. A woman was on her knees, sobbing hysterically, while several men stood around looking helpless. "What happened?" Ruth pushed through the crowd. Tom Callahan turned to her, his face white. "It's the Miller boy. He fell in the well." Ruth's blood went cold. "When?" "Just now. He was playing near the edge and the ground gave way from all the rain. He went straight down." Ruth ran to the well and looked over the edge. It was deep, maybe 30 feet, and narrow. She could barely see the bottom in the darkness, but she could hear crying, faint and terrified, echoing up from below. "He's alive," she said. "For now," Tom said grimly, "but that well's been unstable for years. The walls could collapse any minute, especially after all this rain." Ruth looked around at the gathered crowd. "Does anyone have rope?" "We got rope," someone said, "but ain't nobody small enough to fit down that shaft. It's too narrow." "What about a ladder?" "Won't fit either. The opening's barely 2 feet across." Ruth's mind raced. The boy was trapped 30 feet down in an unstable well. The walls could collapse at any moment, and there was no way to reach him with conventional rescue methods. She turned to the crowd. "Someone get Wade Mercer, now!" A boy took off running. Ruth knelt at the well's edge. "Can you hear me down there?" A small voice echoed up. "I'm scared." "I know you are, but we're going to get you out. What's your name?" "Danny." "Okay, Danny. I need you to stay very still. Don't move around. Can you do that for me?" "It's dark." "I know. But if you stay still and stay calm, we'll have you out soon. Do you trust me?" A pause. Then, "Yes." "Good boy." Wade arrived within minutes, breathing hard from running. He took one look at the situation and his jaw tightened. "How deep?" he asked. 30 feet, maybe more. The opening's too narrow for anyone to climb down." Wade circled the well, examining it from every angle. Then he looked at the crowd. "I need rope, strong rope, and something to use as a harness." "What are you thinking?" Tom asked. "I'm thinking we lower a loop down and the boy ties himself in. Then we pull him up." "He's 7 years old," someone said. "He ain't going to be able to tie himself into a harness properly." Wade's expression didn't change. "Then we talk him through it." Sheriff Hobson appeared, out of breath. "I heard what happened. What do you need?" "Rope and manpower," Wade said. "And we need to move fast. That well could go any minute." Within 10 minutes, they had everything assembled. Wade tied a rescue loop, a simple harness with a seat, and tested it against his own weight. It held. He moved to the well's edge. Danny, can you hear me? Yes, sir. My name's Wade. I'm going to lower a rope down to you. When it gets close, I need you to grab it. Can you do that? I think so. Don't think. Just do it when the time comes. You understand? Yes, sir. Wade began lowering the rope, feeding it down hand over hand. Ruth knelt beside him, peering into the darkness, trying to see the boy. It's almost there, she called down. Reach up, Danny. You should be able to touch it. The rope went slack. I got it, Danny's voice echoed up, stronger now. Wade pulled up slightly to keep tension on the line. Good. Now listen to me very carefully. You're going to sit in that loop like it's a swing. Put your legs through the hole and pull it up under your arms. Can you do that? Ruth held her breath while they waited. The seconds stretched out like hours. I'm in, Danny shouted. Wade looked at Ruth. You sure he's secure? Ruth called down. Danny, hold the rope with both hands and don't let go no matter what. We're bringing you up now. Okay. Wade positioned himself at the well, gripping the rope. Tom Callahan and 3 other men lined up behind him. On 3, we pull steady. No jerking. Nice and smooth. 1, 2, 3. They began hauling the rope up, hand over hand. Ruth watched the opening, her heart in her throat. The rope moved steadily, emerging from the darkness inch by inch. Then the well wall shifted. A grinding sound came from deep below, followed by the splash of falling rocks. Faster! Someone shouted. No, Wade said sharply. Steady! If we pull too fast, we'll lose him. The men kept pulling, sweat running down their faces despite the cold. Ruth could see the top of Danny's head now, his small hands white-knuckled on the rope. Another rock fell. The grinding got louder. Almost there, Ruth called. Just a few more feet, Danny. The boy's face appeared at the opening, streaked with mud and tears. Ruth reached down and grabbed his arms while Wade hauled on the rope. Together, they lifted him out just as a section of the well wall gave way with a sound like thunder. Danny collapsed into Ruth's arms, sobbing. The crowd erupted in cheers. Ruth held the boy tight, her own hands shaking, while his mother ran forward and pulled him away, crying hysterically. Tom clapped Wade on the shoulder. Sheriff Hobson was already organizing people to seal off the well before someone else fell in. Ruth stood slowly, her legs unsteady, and found Wade watching her. You okay? He asked. I think so. She looked at the well, at the rope still hanging over the edge, at the boy being smothered by his grateful mother. That was too close. But we got him. We got lucky. Wade's mouth twitched. Take the win, Ruth. She nodded, too drained to argue. The crowd began to disperse, people heading back to their homes to deal with storm damage. But several lingered, looking at Ruth with expressions she hadn't seen before. Not suspicion, not doubt, respect. Anne Griffith, the woman whose daughter Ruth had treated weeks ago, stepped forward. Miss Calloway, I just wanted to say, what you did just now, keeping that boy calm, knowing what to do, that was... She struggled for words. That was something. Wade did most of it. Wade pulled the rope. You kept that child from panicking long enough to be saved. Anne glanced at the other women standing behind her. We've been talking about what Eleanor Voss said about you, about your father. Ruth's chest tightened. Mrs. Griffith, let me finish. We've been talking, and we decided that we don't much care what your father did back east. We care what you've done here. And what you've done is help people, save people. Work harder than most of us would have in your position. Anne's voice strengthened. Eleanor can say whatever she wants, but we know who you are. And we know who she is, too. One of the other women nodded. She's got money and a nice house, but she ain't never saved a child's life. Ain't never gotten her hands dirty helping folks who couldn't pay. You have. Ruth didn't know what to say, couldn't find words adequate for what was happening. Tom Callahan joined them. Miss Calloway, I owe you twice now. Once for my boy, once for Danny Miller. And I ain't the only one in this town who's in your debt. He looked around at the gathered crowd. Far as I'm concerned, you've earned your place here. Anyone who says different can answer to me. Several other men voiced agreement. Sheriff Hobson cleared his throat. Miss Calloway, I owe you an apology. I let Eleanor Voss's version of things cloud my judgment. That was wrong. You've proven yourself 10 times over, and I should have seen that sooner. Ruth felt tears prickling behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Thank you, all of you. Wade appeared at her elbow. Come on, you need to sit down. He steered her away from the crowd back toward the boarding house. Ruth's legs felt like water. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her shaky and exhausted. Mrs. McKenna was waiting on the porch. She took one look at Ruth's face and went inside to make tea. Ruth sank into a chair, her whole body trembling. Wade sat beside her. "You did good. I didn't do anything. You're the one who rigged the rescue. And you're the one who kept that boy from losing his mind down there. You think I could have done that? I'm about as comforting as a brick wall." Wade leaned back. "You got a gift, Ruth, for making people feel safe when everything's falling apart. That matters." Ruth stared at her hands. They were filthy with mud and rope burns. "I thought I was leaving. 3 days ago, I had a ticket for that train. I was packed and ready to run again. But you stayed. Only because you asked. Then I'm glad I asked." Ruth looked at him, really looked, at the lines around his eyes, the scar through his eyebrow, the way he sat like he was always braced for bad news. This man who'd been alone for 4 years because grief had hollowed him out and left nothing but survival instinct. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "You could have let me leave, let Eleanor win, gone back to your ranch in your silence. Why did you fight for me?" Wade was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, 4 years ago, I lost everything that mattered. My wife, my son, the life we'd built. And I decided that the safest thing was to stop caring, stop connecting, just work the land and keep my head down and wait for time to pass." He looked at her. "Then you showed up. This woman who'd been through hell and kept going anyway, who helped people even when they treated her like dirt, who looked at me like I was still worth something despite being a broken-down widower who couldn't string 2 sentences together." His voice roughened. "You reminded me what it felt like to be alive, and I wasn't ready to lose that." Ruth's throat closed. "I ain't asking for anything," Wade continued. "I know you're still thinking about leaving. I know this town's been cruel to you, and maybe you can't forgive that, but I needed you to know why I stayed, why I fought. Because for the first time since I buried my family, I wanted something more than just getting through the day." Ruth couldn't speak, couldn't process the weight of what he was saying. Mrs. McKenna appeared with tea and set it down without a word. She looked between them, seemed to understand something unspoken was happening, and disappeared back inside. Ruth picked up her cup just to have something to do with her hands. "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "Stay. Let people matter. Risk caring about something I might lose." She took a shaky breath. "Everyone I've ever loved has either died or left me. My father destroyed himself. My mother gave up, and I learned that the only way to survive was to keep moving, never plant roots, never let anyone close enough to hurt you when they go." "I understand that. I know you do. That's what scares me." Ruth set down the cup before she dropped it. "Because you're the first person in years who's made me want to stop running. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to do that." Wade reached over and took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm. "You're the strongest person I know. You just don't see it yet." Ruth looked at their joined hands. She should pull away, should protect herself, should remember that caring about people only led to pain, but she didn't pull away. They sat like that while the town slowly came back to life around them. People cleaning up storm damage and securing broken fences and talking in low voices about the boy who'd fallen down the well and the woman who'd helped save him. That evening, Eleanor Voss rode into town. Ruth saw her from the boarding house window, elegant even on horseback, her clothes immaculate despite the muddy roads. She stopped in front of the sheriff's office and went inside. Mrs. McKenna appeared beside Ruth. "That woman's got nerve, I'll give her that. What do you think she wants?" "Probably heard what happened with the Miller boy, probably realizing that her campaign to destroy you ain't working out the way she planned." The older woman's expression was grim. "Eleanor don't like losing. She's going to try something else." Wade came downstairs, saw Eleanor's horse outside the sheriff's office, and his expression hardened. "Stay here." "Wade, just stay here, please." He walked out before Ruth could argue. Ruth watched from the window as Wade crossed the street and entered the sheriff's office. She couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see shadows moving behind the curtains. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then the door opened and Eleanor emerged. her face tight with barely controlled fury. She mounted her horse without looking back and rode out of town at a speed that sent mud flying. Wade returned to the boarding house looking exhausted. "What happened?" Ruth asked. "I told her it was over, that she'd lost, that the more she tried to destroy you, the stronger you got in people's eyes." He sat heavily in a chair. "She didn't take it well." "What did she say?" "That I was making the biggest mistake of my life, that defending you would cost me everything, that people would remember I chose a criminal's daughter over respectability." Wade's jaw tightened. "Then Hobson told her that what happened today proved you had more character than she'd ever have, and that if she kept spreading lies, he'd make sure everyone knew she was just bitter because I turned down her advances years ago." Ruth's eyes widened. "She came after you?" "Right after my wife died. Showed up at the ranch with food and sympathy and made it real clear she was interested in being the next Mrs. Mercer." Wade's expression was disgusted. "I sent her away. Apparently she didn't forgive that. So that's what this was really about. Not Ruth's father, not protecting the town, just wounded pride and rejection festering for years until Eleanor found a target she could punish." "I'm sorry," Ruth said quietly. "I'm sorry you got pulled into this." "I ain't. This needed settling anyway." Wade looked at her. "Eleanor's gonna leave you alone now. She knows she can't win. The town saw you save that boy today, and no amount of rumors can erase that. So it's over. It's over." Ruth should have felt relieved, victorious even, but all she felt was tired. That night, the boarding house dining room was more crowded than usual. People who'd avoided Ruth for weeks suddenly wanted to eat where she served. They nodded at her, made small talk. A few even apologized directly. Ruth accepted it all with quiet grace, but inside she felt hollow. Later, she found Wade on the back porch, staring at the stars. "You okay?" he asked without turning around. "I won," Ruth said. "I should be happy." "But you ain't." "No." She leaned against the railing. "Because winning just means I get to stay in a place that was ready to throw me out a week ago. These same people who are being nice to me now. They turned their backs when Eleanor told them to. They believed the worst without asking for my side. And now they want to pretend it never happened." Wade nodded slowly. "You're right. They were cruel, and they were cowards. And forgiving that ain't easy. So why should I stay?" "Because leaving means Eleanor was right, that you don't belong, that you're not strong enough to build something here." Wade turned to face her. "And because running don't actually solve anything. I know, I tried it for 4 years. All it did was make me more alone." Ruth looked at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you got a choice to make. You can leave and start over somewhere else, hoping the next place treats you better. Or you can stay and build a life here despite what happened, despite the people who failed you, despite everything." He stepped closer. "And if you stay, you won't be alone. I'll be here. Mrs. McKenna will be here. Tom Callahan and Ann Griffith and all the folks who stood up for you today, they'll be here. That's not enough. Maybe not, but it's something." Wade's voice softened. "And sometimes something is all we get. The question is whether that's enough for you." Ruth felt tears burning behind her eyes again. She was so tired of crying, so tired of fighting, so tired of carrying weight she never asked for. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "Yes, you can. You've already done harder things." Wade reached out and brushed a tear from her cheek. "You crossed half a country alone. You survived being stranded with nothing. You built a life from scratch. You stood up to the most powerful woman in the territory, and you saved 2 children from dying. You can do anything." Ruth let herself lean into his touch, just for a moment, just long enough to remember what it felt like to be held up by someone else. Then she stepped back. "I need time to think." "Take all the time you need. I ain't going anywhere." Ruth went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her packed trunk. Everything she owned was in there, ready to go, ready to run. But for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she didn't want to run. She wanted to stay. She wanted to see what would happen if she stopped moving long enough to let roots take hold. Wanted to find out if the fragile connections she'd built could become something stronger. Wanted to know if the feeling growing between her and Wade could survive being tested by time and proximity and all the messy complications of real life. She wanted to be brave enough to choose staying over safety, The decision settled over her like snow, quiet and complete. In the morning, Ruth would unpack her trunk. She would tell Wade she was staying. She would start building the kind of life she'd never let herself imagine before. But tonight, she sat in the darkness and let herself feel the weight of everything that had brought her to this moment. The losses, the shame, the fear, all of it. And then, slowly, she let it go. Ruth woke before dawn and started unpacking her trunk. She did it slowly, methodically, taking each item out and finding a place for it. Her dresses went in the small wardrobe, her mother's journal on the nightstand. The photograph she'd carried across half the country stayed at the bottom of the trunk. She still wasn't ready to look at it, but she wasn't ready to burn it either. Some things you just had to carry. Mrs. McKenna found her an hour later, folding the last shawl. The older woman stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "You're staying then?" It wasn't a question. Ruth set the shawl in the drawer. "I'm staying." "Good. Was getting tired of wondering when you'd figure out you belonged here." Mrs. McKenna's voice was gruff, but her eyes were soft. "You'll take the room at the end of the hall. Bigger windows, gets better light, and I'm cutting your rent in half since you've been working yourself raw keeping this place running." "Mrs. McKenna." "Don't argue with me, girl. I've decided." The older woman turned to leave, then paused. "Your mother would be proud of you. Staying when it'd be easier to run. That takes guts." Ruth's throat tightened. "Thank you." After Mrs. McKenna left, Ruth sat on the bed and let herself feel the weight of the decision. She was staying. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because somewhere between saving the Callahan boy and healing Wade's horse and standing up to Eleanor Voss, Black Hollow had stopped being a place she was trapped and started being a place she could build something. It terrified her, but it also felt right. She found Wade an hour later behind the boarding house, splitting firewood even though they already had enough to last through spring. He worked with the same focused intensity he brought to everything, each swing precise and powerful. Ruth waited until he paused to catch his breath. "I'm staying." Wade set down the axe. Sweat dampened his shirt despite the cold morning air. "Yeah?" "Yeah." Something shifted in his expression, relief mixed with something deeper. "Good." They stood there in the quiet morning, not touching, just existing in the same space. After a moment, Wade picked up the axe again. "Help me stack this," he asked. It was such a simple request, so ordinary, but Ruth understood what he was really asking. "Can we just be normal for a while? Can we build something without rushing it?" "Sure," she said. They worked together in comfortable silence, Wade splitting while Ruth stacked the pieces against the wall. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning frost. By the time they finished, Ruth's hands were rough with splinters and her back ached, but she felt settled in a way she hadn't in years. Over the next few weeks, Ruth's life in Black Hollow found a rhythm. She treated patients in the mornings, the flow of people returning to steady now that Eleanor's influence had crumbled. She helped Mrs. McKenna with the boarding house in the afternoons. And several evenings a week, she rode out to Wade's ranch. Those visits were her favorite part. Wade would be working when she arrived, mending fence, tending horses, fixing whatever had broken that week. Ruth would help where she could, learning the rhythms of ranch work. Then they'd sit on his porch and talk while the sun set, sharing the kind of conversation that came easier when your hands were busy and your eyes were on the horizon instead of each other. Wade told her about his wife, Sarah, about how they'd met when they were barely old enough to know what love was. About their son, Jacob, who'd been 6 years old when the fever took him. About the guilt Wade still carried for not being able to save them. "I was out on the range when it started," he said one evening, his voice rough with old pain. "By the time I got back, Sarah was burning up with fever and Jacob couldn't stop crying. Doc Miller did what he could, but it wasn't enough. They died 3 days apart." Wade stared at his hands. "I keep thinking if I'd been home, maybe I could have done something. Got help sooner. I don't know. But I wasn't there when they needed me most." Ruth reached over and took his hand. "You can't carry that. You didn't know. And even if you'd been there, maybe it wouldn't have changed anything. Sometimes people die and there's no one to blame. It just happens. Doesn't make it easier." "No. But blaming yourself doesn't bring them back either." Ruth squeezed his hand. "You survived. That's what you were supposed to do. And now you get to decide what you do with that survival. You can spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for living, or you can let yourself have something good again. Wade looked at her with eyes that held 4 years of grief. What if I lose it again? Then you lose it, and it'll hurt worse than anything. But at least you'll have had it. Ruth's voice softened. My mother used to say that loving people is the bravest thing we do, because we know going in that we'll lose them eventually. Everyone dies, everyone leaves, but we love them anyway. That's what makes us human. Wade was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Your mother sounds like she was smart. She was, and sad, and tired, but she loved fiercely while she could. Ruth looked out at the darkening sky. I think she would have liked you. Yeah? Yeah. She had a soft spot for people who carried their pain quietly. They sat in silence after that, hands still linked, while the stars came out one by one. As winter turned toward spring, Black Hollow began to change. The railroad bridge was repaired, the town well was filled in, and a new one dug. Tom Callahan took his son to Denver to see a specialist about his breathing problems, funded by Wade's quiet generosity. The boy returned a month later with medicine that actually worked and a smile that split his face. But the biggest change was in how people treated Ruth. The ones who'd turned their backs during Eleanor's campaign came to her with apologies that ranged from sincere to awkward to painfully inadequate. Ruth accepted them all with the same quiet grace. She didn't forget what they'd done. The memory of standing alone while the town condemned her was carved too deep to erase. But she chose to let them move forward anyway, because holding on to bitterness would only poison the life she was trying to build. Some people understood that forgiveness didn't mean things went back to how they were. Others expected her to just forget and were disappointed when she kept a careful distance. Ruth learned to tell the difference. Anne Griffith became a real friend, not just a grateful patient. They'd sit together at the boarding house talking about their lives while mending clothes or preparing food. Anne had lost a husband to a mining accident 3 years back and understood what it meant to rebuild from nothing. You're doing good, Anne told her one afternoon. Holding your head up, not letting what happened break you. Ruth threaded her needle. Some days it feels like I'm barely holding on. That's what bravery looks like. It ain't heroic speeches and grand gestures. It's just getting up every morning and deciding to keep trying even when it'd be easier to quit. Anne knotted her thread. You think Wade Mercer got through 4 years of grief by being strong every day? No. He got through it by being strong enough, often enough. That's all any of us can do. The word settled into Ruth like truth. She'd spent so long thinking she had to be perfect, had to prove herself beyond any doubt, had to earn her place through flawless work and unwavering strength. But that wasn't sustainable. Nobody could carry that weight forever. What she could do was show up, work hard, help where she could, and forgive herself on the days when it wasn't enough. Eleanor Voss left Black Hollow in early April. The news spread through town like wildfire. She'd sold her ranch to a cattle company out of Denver and was moving east to live with her brother. Some said she couldn't stand losing. Others whispered that the town had finally seen through her cruelty and she couldn't take the scrutiny. Ruth heard the news from Sheriff Hobson, who stopped by the boarding house with an expression that might have been relief. Thought you'd want to know, he said. Eleanor's gone. Left this morning without saying goodbye to anyone. Ruth felt nothing, no triumph, no satisfaction, just a hollow sense of completion. Good for her, she said quietly. Hobson raised an eyebrow. That's it? After everything she did to you? What do you want me to say? That I'm glad she's miserable? That I hope she suffers? Ruth shook her head. She was cruel because she was unhappy. Leaving town won't fix that. She'll just be unhappy somewhere else. That's punishment enough. The sheriff studied her face. You're a better person than most, Miss Calloway. I'm just tired of carrying hate. It's too heavy. After Hobson left, Ruth sat on the boarding house porch and thought about Eleanor Voss. About how someone could have everything, money, power, beauty, and still be so consumed by bitterness that they destroyed themselves trying to destroy others. It was a kind of tragedy, even if it was self-inflicted. Ruth wondered if Eleanor would ever find whatever she was looking for. Probably not. Some people were too broken by their own choices to ever heal, but that wasn't Ruth's problem anymore. Wade found her there an hour later, lost in thought. Heard Eleanor left, he said. settling into the chair beside her. News travels fast. Always does. Wade stretched his legs out. How do you feel about it? Ruth considered the question. Relieved, I guess. And sad. Not for her specifically, just sad that people can be that way. That they can have so much and still need to take from others. That's just how some folks are built. They don't know how to be happy. They only know how to win. Wade's voice was thoughtful. My father was like that. Never satisfied with what he had. Always reaching for more. Died alone because he'd pushed everyone away chasing things that didn't matter. Is that why you live the way you do, alone on that ranch? Partly. After Sarah and Jacob died, I realized all the things I thought mattered. Building a big operation, making money, expanding the land. None of it meant anything without people to share it with. So I stopped chasing, just focused on surviving. He looked at her. Until you showed up and reminded me that surviving ain't the same as living. Ruth's heart did something complicated in her chest. Wade, I ain't saying this to pressure you. I just want you to know that you changed something in me. Made me want more than just getting through the day. His voice was steady, sure. And I'm grateful for that. Whatever happens next. Ruth reached for his hand. You changed something in me, too. You made me believe I could stay somewhere. That I could stop running. They sat like that, hands linked, while the afternoon stretched toward evening. It wasn't a declaration of love or a promise of forever. It was just two people acknowledging that they'd found something worth protecting in each other. And for now, that was enough. As spring deepened into summer, Wade started spending more time in town. He'd ride in several times a week, ostensibly to pick up supplies or check on business, but everyone knew he was really coming to see Ruth. They'd walk together after she finished her rounds, talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes Wade would help her gather herbs in the hills. Sometimes Ruth would ride out to his ranch, and they'd work side by side until sunset. The town watched this courtship with interest, but notably without judgment. Tom Callahan started a friendly betting pool on when Wade would actually propose. Mrs. McKenna threatened to hit anyone with a broom who asked Ruth about her intentions. Ruth found herself laughing more, sleeping better, looking forward to tomorrow instead of just enduring today. One evening in late June, Wade showed up at the boarding house with something wrapped in cloth. Got something for you, he said, suddenly awkward in a way Ruth had never seen. She unwrapped it carefully and found a small wooden carving, a meadowlark, every feather detailed with painstaking care. It fit perfectly in her palm. You made this? She asked, stunned. Wade nodded. Been working on it at night, when I couldn't sleep. He cleared his throat. Meadowlarks were Sarah's favorite. She used to say their songs sounded like hope, and I thought maybe you'd like to have one, since you gave me hope again. Ruth turned the carving over in her hands, seeing the hours of work in every careful cut. This wasn't just a gift. It was Wade telling her something he didn't have words for. It's beautiful, she said softly. Thank you. Wade looked relieved. There's something else I wanted to ask you. Ruth's heart started beating faster. I know we've been taking things slow, and I know you got your own life here, your work, your patients, but I was wondering. He took a breath. Would you consider coming to live at the ranch, not as a hired hand or a guest, as my partner, someone who belongs there as much as I do? Ruth's breath caught. Wade, I ain't asking for marriage if you ain't ready. I'm just asking if you'd be willing to build something with me, on land that could be ours instead of just mine. His eyes were honest, vulnerable. I know it's a lot to ask, but I can't imagine that place without you anymore. Ruth looked at the meadowlark in her hand, then at Wade's face. She thought about the boarding house that had given her shelter when she had nothing, about Mrs. McKenna who'd stood by her, about the patients who depended on her. But she also thought about the empty ranch house that Wade rattled around in alone, about the life they could build together if she was brave enough to try, about waking up to mountain views and falling asleep to the sound of horses in the barn and filling that silent house with warmth and conversation and possibility. I have conditions, she said. Wade nodded. Name them. I keep seeing patients. I don't stop being a healer just because I'm living on a ranch. Wouldn't ask you to. And I need to tell Mrs. McKenna myself. She's been good to me. I owe her that. Of course. And we do this as equals. Your ranch becomes our ranch. Your decisions become our decisions. I'm not just moving in to cook and clean, I'm building a life. Wade's mouth curved into a smile, a real one, the kind that transformed his whole face. Deal. Ruth felt tears prickling her eyes. Then, yes, I'll come to the ranch. I'll build something with you. Wade pulled her into his arms, holding her tight enough that she could feel his heart pounding. Ruth pressed her face against his chest and let herself believe finally that this was real, that she'd found a place to belong and a person to belong with, that all the running and hiding and surviving had led her here. Mrs. McKenna took the news with characteristic bluntness. About damn time, she said when Ruth told her. Been watching you two dance around each other for months. Thought I'd have to lock you in a room together. Ruth laughed through tears. I'm going to miss living here. Ranch ain't that far. You can visit, and I expect you to keep helping out when you're in town treating patients. Mrs. McKenna's voice softened. You've been good for this place, Ruth Calloway, and you've been good for Wade Mercer. That man was half dead when you showed up. Now he looks like he might actually have a future worth living. He gave me a future too. Then you're even. Mrs. McKenna pulled Ruth into a rare hug. Your room's always here if you need it. Remember that. Ruth packed her trunk for the last time, but this time it wasn't an escape. It was a beginning. Wade came for her on a clear morning in early July, driving a wagon loaded with supplies. Tom Callahan and his son helped load Ruth's belongings. Ann Griffith brought fresh bread for the journey. Even Sheriff Hobson stopped by to wish her well. Ruth took one last look at the boarding house that had sheltered her when she had nowhere else to go, then climbed onto the wagon seat beside Wade. They rode north together, leaving Black Hollow behind but not forgotten. The ranch looked different in summer. Green where it had been brown, alive where it had seemed dormant. Wade pulled the wagon up to the house and helped Ruth down. Welcome home, he said quietly. Ruth looked at the house, the barn, the corrals stretching toward the mountains. She thought about the first time she'd come here, desperate to help Wade's injured horse, terrified of being sent away. She'd been so lost then, so broken by shame and fear and the weight of her father's crimes. But she wasn't that person anymore. She'd saved lives, built friendships, stood up to cruelty and won. She'd learned that belonging wasn't something you earned through perfection. It was something you built through showing up, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. And she'd learned that love wasn't about finding someone to fix you. It was about finding someone to build with, someone who saw your scars and didn't flinch, someone who carried their own damage and understood that healing was a choice you made every day, not a destination you reached. Wade carried her trunk inside while Ruth stood in the doorway of what was now her home. The house still needed work. The floors were dusty. The windows needed cleaning. The whole place had the stale feeling of somewhere that had been functional but not lived in. But Ruth could see what it could become, could imagine herbs drying from the rafters, books on the shelves, curtains in the windows, the warmth of a fire and the smell of cooking and the sound of conversation filling rooms that had been silent for too long. She could imagine a life here. Over the following weeks, Ruth transformed the ranch house. She cleaned and organized and brought color to places that had only known brown and gray. She planted an herb garden near the kitchen door. She convinced Wade to build bookshelves in the front room so she'd have somewhere to keep her mother's journals and the medical books she'd started collecting. Wade watched this transformation with something like wonder. He'd tell her later that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have a home instead of just a place to sleep. That watching her bring the house to life reminded him of when Sarah had first moved in, turning a bachelor's quarters into something that mattered. Ruth understood that he wasn't comparing them. He was just remembering that houses needed people to become homes, and that he was grateful to be reminded of that truth. They fell into a rhythm. Wade would work the ranch during the day while Ruth tended her garden and prepared remedies. Several times a week, she'd ride into Black Hollow to see patients, coming back in the evening to share supper and stories with Wade. On weekends, they'd work together, mending fence, training horses, doing the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running. It wasn't perfect. They argued sometimes about small things, how to organize the barn, whether to buy more cattle, whose turn it was to cook. Wade was stubborn and Ruth was proud, and sometimes they'd go hours without speaking because neither wanted to admit they'd been wrong. But they always came back together, always talked it through, always remembered that what they were building was more important than being right. One evening in September, almost a year to the day after Ruth had first arrived in Black Hollow, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Wade reached over and took her hand. "I got something to ask you." Ruth looked at him. "You already asked me to live here. What's left?" "Marriage." Wade said it simple and direct. "I want you to be my wife, officially. So the whole world knows you belong here, and I belong to you." Ruth's breath caught. She'd known this was coming eventually, but hearing the actual words still made her heart race. "I don't have a ring yet," Wade continued, "and I ain't good at fancy speeches. But I'm good at keeping promises. And I promise that if you marry me, I'll spend every day making sure you never regret choosing to stay." Ruth thought about the girl who'd stepped off that stagecoach a year ago, lost and desperate and running from shame she didn't know how to shed. She thought about everything she'd survived to get here, all the pain and fear and struggle, and she thought about how none of it had been wasted, because all of it had led her to this moment, to this man, to this life. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." Wade pulled her into his arms, and Ruth let herself sink into the embrace, let herself believe that this was real, that she'd finally found what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Not escape, not redemption, just a place to belong and a person to build with. They married a month later in a simple ceremony in Black Hollow. Mrs. McKenna stood up with Ruth. Tom Callahan stood with Wade. The whole town turned out to watch, filling the small church until people spilled out onto the steps. Sheriff Hobson officiated, reading the vows in his steady voice. When he got to the part about speaking now or forever holding your peace, Anne Griffith's daughter shouted, "Kiss her already!" and the whole congregation laughed. Wade did kiss her, gentle and sure, and Ruth felt the last piece of her old life fall away. She was Ruth Mercer now, not Ruth Calloway, daughter of a criminal, not the disgraced woman from back east, just Ruth Mercer, wife of a rancher, healer to a town that had learned to value her. That was enough. The years that followed weren't easy. The ranch struggled some years with drought and hard winters. Ruth lost patients she couldn't save and carried that weight the way healers always did. Wade still had days when grief caught him sideways and he'd retreat into silence until Ruth pulled him back. But they built something anyway. Built a life from work and patience and the stubborn refusal to give up when things got hard. They had arguments and reconciliations, long nights and early mornings, small victories and bitter disappointments. They had each other. 5 years after Ruth arrived in Black Hollow, she stood in the herb garden behind the ranch house, hands pressed to her swelling belly, and felt their child kick for the first time. Wade came around the corner and saw her face. "You okay?" he asked. The baby moved. Wade crossed the garden in 3 strides and placed his hand where hers had been. They stood like that, waiting, until the baby kicked again and Wade's face transformed with wonder. "Sarah would have liked this," he said quietly, "like knowing that life kept going, that I found happiness again." Ruth covered his hand with hers. "I think my mother would have liked it too. She always said the best revenge against pain was living well anyway." They stood in the garden while the sun climbed higher, 2 people who'd survived loss and shame and loneliness, now building something new from what remained. Because that's what humans did. They survived. They adapted. They found each other in the wreckage and built something worth protecting. Ruth had spent so long running from her father's crimes, trying to escape a shame that followed her like a shadow. She'd thought that if she could just get far enough away, if she could just prove herself worthy enough, the weight would lift. But that's not how it worked. The weight only lifted when she stopped running, when she stood still long enough to let people see who she actually was instead of who her father had been, when she chose to build instead of hide. Black Hollow had tested her, had pushed her to the edge of breaking, but it had also given her the chance to prove that she was more than her worst moment, more than her family's failures, more than the shame she'd carried across half a country. She was Ruth Mercer, healer, wife, soon-to-be mother. She was someone who'd looked at a life that offered nothing and built something anyway, and that was the only redemption that mattered. That evening, Ruth and Wade sat on their porch like they did most evenings, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The meadowlark Wade had carved for her sat on the windowsill inside, catching the last light. "You ever regret staying?" Wade asked quietly. Ruth thought about it, really thought. about all the pain that had come with this choice, the struggle, the uncertainty, the moments when she'd wondered if she was strong enough. "No," she said finally, "I don't regret it. This life is hard, and it's not always fair, and some days I'm so tired I can barely stand. But it's mine. I built it, and that makes it worth everything." Wade nodded, pulling her closer. "Good, because I can't imagine this place without you anymore." Ruth leaned into his warmth and watched the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. Somewhere in the distance, a real meadowlark sang its evening song, clear and bright and achingly beautiful. She listened to that song and thought about hope, about how it wasn't something you found or earned. It was something you chose. Every day, in 100 small ways. You chose to get up when it would be easier to stay down. You chose to help when it would be safer to hide. You chose to stay when running seemed smarter. You chose to love knowing you could lose everything. That was hope. And that was courage. And that was enough. Ruth Mercer closed her eyes, felt her husband's arm around her, and their child moving inside her, and chose hope one more time. The end.
It's not impossible. No, because they probably had someone awake at all times, and it would be awkward. Yo, mama tastes like piss. What the hell? That's not cool, man. What the fuck? My mama does not taste like piss, bro. Fucking birds! Get off my goddamn head! Alright, man. We get it. We get it. We get it. Get the fuck off my head. Oh! Oh no. They're jumping me, man! Oh! Oh! Wait, I can fly back to the place from here. Oh! What the fuck? They jumping me, man! Coconut poo tastes like poo. Oh shit. Oh, I'm like a fucking pilot. Get off my fucking head! They're in the building now. Oh no. Hopefully this doesn't knock the fucking thing over. How you doing, Connor? How you been? I can't see a fucking thing. Ah! That's not good. I don't even think I heard it that time. Oh shit! I'm okay. Hey guys.